Hello, and welcome to Yogahub podcast, where we bring you conversations with some of the world's leading yoga and movement educators. In this episode, I'm talking to Celest Pereira. Celeste is a physiotherapist and yoga teacher based in London who specialises in functional neurology, which approaches movement by first looking at the brain and the nervous system and how we can improve our movement capabilities by improving our mind-body connection. It's a super interesting approach, and we're very lucky to be hosting Celeste at our Camden Street studio for a series of workshops the very first weekend in November. You can find out more information about those at yogahub.ie/workshops. And Celeste is also going to be in Ireland at the Yoga Picnic Festival in Westmeath this summer, which is a really, really lovely event. I'd highly recommend checking it out if you're around. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Celeste. All right, sweet. So Celeste, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation. It's lovely to get the opportunity to chat to you. I always like to begin with what I consider to be the most important question of the day, which is, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing so good. I'm so honored to be here speaking to you, and especially honored that I'm going to be coming to your studio to share with all of your students and your community. It's going to be really, really special to meet everybody. And so thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we're very, very excited to have you over. It'll be your first time visiting with us, but I know that you're over a little bit in Ireland a little bit earlier in the summer for the yoga picnic, which is going to be awesome as well. Anybody listening who has the opportunity to go, I would highly recommend checking it out. Lots of great teachers, including Celeste. But for anybody who maybe isn't super familiar with you and your work at this moment in time, I think it's always nice to maybe begin with just giving you a little bit of space to talk a little bit to your background in as much or as little detail as you would like to share.
Oh, thanks, Brian. I mean, I guess the most important thing to say is currently I have an online anatomy education business where I teach yoga teacher trainings and also anatomy. And the kind of weird pathway that led me to that was definitely not planned. I started out really wanting to be a dancer and moved to England and realized that the competition was so much more intense than I could ever have imagined living in a small town in South Africa. So life led me down the path of fitness, and it's in the world of fitness that I discovered yoga. And from yoga, I decided, you know what, I really want to learn more about the human body. So I went and studied a degree in physiotherapy. And after my degree, I qualified as a yoga teacher. And then one thing led to another is the best way of putting it. So I started teaching, I started working with loads of different people, and here I am today. I'm actually specializing now in functional neurology. My client base is mostly of people that have sustained some kind of concussion that I've been told was not severe or that was not anything noteworthy, but their life has really had significant impact post that period. And so that's where I'll come in with all my weird brain drills, and we'll test things out and see what helps the person. And yeah, that's a big passion of mine. And then alongside that, we do all the yoga stuff with the teacher trainings and the anatomy education.
So two questions I'd like to ask you just from that. But the first one, I guess, would be so you started practicing yoga, then did your physiotherapy degree, and then did your teacher training?
Yeah.
And how did the physiotherapy study inform or change your practice and your teaching as you began upon that?
Brian, I'd love to sit here and tell you that it was so revolutionary, and I looked at how everyone was doing yoga and I thought, I know better. And to be perfectly honest with you, that is the exact opposite. I was still so just absorbing everything from every single angle that I could. And so, if you put me in a hatha class, I was like the best hatha student. I used to do everything there. And then Ashtanga, oh my goodness, I followed all the rules. And I started actually doing Dharma Mitra, and I really wanted to be as bendy and as intense as that demographic. And I guess it was more age and wisdom and self-study that kind of led me down this path of recognizing I just started talking to a lot of people, and I was like, wow, a lot of people are injured. And, I don't feel particularly great in my body. Like, it shouldn't be this way. I don't understand why that's the case. And I kept going back to my biomechanics, and I thought, no, do you know what? It's because I'm really treating my body like an athlete. And that's why I'm struggling. Like, that's the only explanation, because yoga is the best thing since sliced bread. And I remember going to a physio who was a really good friend of mine. And she was just like, you know how you're very hypermobile, right? And it was so strange. Even though I had learned certain things at university, certain things didn't. It's so weird when you know information you don't often look at yourself and think, oh, that I see myself in that information that I'm learning about. And particularly in the realm of hypermobility, to be fair, we didn't spend a lot of time on that topic in uni, but it's definitely gained momentum since that time in the last, since when did I graduate? 2009. And it was when the physio said that to me that suddenly a penny dropped that, wow, there are like a lot of different body types with different requirements and different needs. And what's happening in the yoga world was, for me, something that I wanted to step away from, which was this is the practice and this is what's good for you, regardless of actually looking at the individual and making really keen assessments as to, is the set sequence adequate for this individual and their needs given their history. And so following on from that, I then met someone in the world of functional neurology, and I started to dive deeper into that topic. And here we are today where, gosh, my practice is very different. It involves more like cardio and lifting weights, and maybe a couple of times a week I'm doing a yoga practice, but definitely not, I was going every single day and doing such intense things. It's just not what I'm doing anymore.
It's a really interesting thing that you said there, that you were treating your body as an athlete. And I think for me, when I first started doing yoga, I wasn't very flexible. I wasn't very bendy, but I was trying to fit myself into a certain type of practice with traditional Ashtanga and very dynamic vinyasa things. And I definitely improved in so many ways. But in hindsight, looking back, I don't know if that kind of practice was maybe on a physical level what I needed at that time. No, I think I built a certain level of body awareness and mindfulness through it that I don't in any way regret going through those kind of practices. But particularly for when I started getting into handstands, and I really enjoyed them, and I found them so fun, so enjoyable, trying to replicate the shapes that I would see people doing on Instagram. And eventually I met, I don't know if you've ever come across a guy called Miguel Santana before. He's on Instagram as Miguel on Hands. Yeah, and I met him in Australia. Incredible handstander, an incredible guy, an amazing teacher. And I started working with him, and he gave me this handstand program where for a while I was doing maybe an hour and a half of training a day solely for handstands. Wow. And I got really good, but I was also in bits. Like I was sore and I was getting like problems with my elbows that I'd never gotten before. And while I still love handstands, at that stage I also had my first child at that point. And anyways, all of these things kind of aligned where I was like, I don't know if this is what I need to be doing. But I think sometimes, I think it's changing. But I know when I first got into yoga, there was this like perception through social media, not even social media. If you kind of look at older yogic texts, people with their legs behind their heads and all this sort of stuff, that we have this perception of yoga as being a very athletic activity, which maybe potentially, if you're only going to 2 or 3 classes a week and you just want to feel a little bit better, that's not necessarily the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That is such wisdom. I mean, what the thing that I'm picking out from what you've been saying is, it's, especially when your first child was born, I think perspective was added into the mix. And that's kind of what happened to me when the physio was like, you're hypermobile and you really should be doing some weight training and kind of balancing the scales. And I remember kicking back and being like, yeah, but this is my job. And if I'm not like really, really good at it, then like no one will come to my classes. So yeah, I hope this is answering your question. But basically it is just about kind of zooming out and really, I think there are a few people in the community that are so brilliant at reminding us, always ask why. Why are you doing what you're doing? And if you can genuinely say like, look, I'm training for a specific reason, it's X, Y, and Z, and that is why I'm dedicating this time. And I understand that that's going to have some risks and I'm willing to take those risks. That's great. Fine, go for it. But, if you're not too sure why you're getting your leg behind your head, maybe it's something to just wonder, is this like, if I'm going to be a mum and I'm going to maybe be pregnant and I'm going to be carrying babies, like, is getting my leg behind my head going to serve my bigger purpose, which is actually to be an effective human body that's able to handle the stresses of being a parent, or whatever your goals are outside of the yoga practice?
So functional neurology, for anyone who has maybe never heard that term before, in layman's terms, you might do your best to explain it to us. And why it's something that might be useful for a yoga practitioner or yoga teacher to consider maybe integrating into their approach?
So we have to remember that everything that you can do, say, think, every thought, every action, every time you decide what you're going to eat versus actually the action of eating, the action of cooking, everything that you do first comes from the brain. Every hormone function, every heartbeat, everything is happening first from a signal from the brain. The only thing that bypasses the brain are a couple of things like walking. Walking is initiated from the brain, but then it'll go via the spinal cord just to save time. But it always touches the central nervous system. Everything always touches the central nervous system. So when you think, oh, I want to get good at handstands, and you're like, right, I need to strengthen my shoulders and I need to strengthen my core and get my glutes fired up. That's amazing. Yes, you should do those things. But you have to remember that for those muscles to get strong, the initiation comes from the brain. And what happens through our life experience is sometimes we have muffled inputs. And by inputs, I'm referring to how well we can see, smell, taste, touch, feel, how well our internal body signals are functioning, known as interoception, or how well our proprioceptive system, our muscles and joints and skin, is feeding information to the brain. There might be issues with that. Maybe we've got a scar on our skin. Maybe we need glasses, or we've been staring at screens too much. Maybe we had long COVID and our internal body signals are a bit muffled. Well, now we've got muffled signals coming into the brain. And then at the level of the brain has to interpret those signals. And maybe there's been some kind of whiplash injury, or maybe a car accident. And so at the level of the brain's now struggling to interpret some of that incoming information. The chances of then having a really good output to the muscles, the joints and the core and the glutes to perform those actions to get better at your handstand, those could be reduced. So functional neurology appreciates the fact that the brain and the nervous system is really at the center of it all. And instead of going, I need to strengthen my shoulders to get better at handstands, which is true, it recognizes that that's just one piece of a very complex puzzle. To get good at handstands, we also have to alternate our body into a different shape, getting our head closer to the ground and our feet up. That's going to put a lot of stress on the vestibular system, our balance. Our eyes have to stare at the ground and they have to come looking at a single point. That's called convergence. That's a brain stem initiated activity. We have to have our neural tension through the median nerve of the wrist on a very high degree of tension to be able to sustain that wrist angle. So what functional neurology does is it just zooms out a bit and it looks at the whole system instead of putting your blinkers on and focusing just on what we've been taught traditionally in movement to look at the neck down. It actually looks at the entire system and it appreciates all of the movement aspects and the strengthening aspect. Yes, you do need to get your muscles stronger, but you also need to appreciate that there are many other far more important systems that are playing a bigger role in getting you to achieve your goals.
It's super interesting. I read an article recently, I can't remember who it was by, but they were talking about, I think that studies have shown within weightlifting, as people's muscles grow in size, the first thing that is actually strengthened is the neurological connection between the brain and that muscle. Yeah. That the first thing that has to be there is the brain body connection, and then the muscle size will build on top of that. And one thing that I'd be interested to know your thoughts. So I think you said with like whiplash, for example, or scarring or whatever, that can cause issues when it comes to, let's say, movement performance. Would that be due to nerve damage, like a safety issue, the brain just feeling less secure with a certain part of the body, or how could something like an injury cause these neurological issues?
So it's such a brilliant question. So there are multiple things you've touched upon there. Let's start with a scar. So all of your body is mapped in your brain. Right now, if you rub your hands together, you feel your palms, but actually it's your brain that's feeling that. It's not your hands. Okay. The signals are going from your hands to your brain. And at the level of your brain, you are registering sensation at the level of your hands. It's backwards than what we've thought. If there's a big scar, that will have reduced receptor input to the brain because some of those receptors would have been damaged. And also because often at a level of a scar, those receptors would sometimes when people have a scar, they don't like people touching it. They don't like things stimulating it. So when you don't use it, you lose it. So those receptors will eventually die off. So at the level of the brain, if you imagine a map that's very crispy and clear on your iPhone, and you can really navigate the streets of wherever you are. Imagine dropping your phone and then that screen cracks, and it's now very difficult to see the map. If there's a scar and you're getting reduced inputs to the brain, the maps in your brain become fuzzy, and then it becomes a little bit harder for the brain to go, oh, this person is in a handstand position, or oh, this person is now reaching for a teacup. Suddenly that scar makes it harder for the brain to go, oh, I'm in this position, I'm doing this action. And that's very scary. So you're right on both fronts. One, there's a reduction in the actual neurological tissue. And the second is that produces what we call threatening signals, because we don't have actually any pain signals in the body, but what we have got is nociceptors, and they relay signals of threat to the brain. And then the brain decides whether or not the threat is enough to elicit the output of pain. So yeah, I mean, that's one example. What was the other example? We had scar.
Whiplash.
Whiplash. Okay, so this is fascinating. Your brainstem, which is the oldest part of your brain, actually just slightly kind of comes down into the upper vertebra of the neck. And just like if I had to crack a whip, the very top of the whip would kind of make that big snapping, cracking sound. And particularly the same thing happens with your neck. If you go into that huge whiplash action, very often the top of the brainstem or the whole brainstem area can sustain a trauma off the back of that. And the brainstem is such a fascinating part of our nervous system because the brainstem deals with your autonomics. Those are all the things you don't have to think about, like blinking, swallowing, your stomach rumbling as it digests your food, your gut passing through to get all your nutrients, your bladder functioning. All of those things are happening from the level of the brainstem. So a lot of times people that have sustained a whiplash injury will have really weird things going on in their body, and they've been to the doctors and the doctors just don't know what to tell them. And they often kind of just passed off as hypochondriacs, or, you'll get through it, or they give them loads of medication. But when they come to me, the first thing I do is take a detailed history, and I ask them about things like contact sports. Have you ever fallen off of a horse? Have you had a car accident? Did you have sustained a whiplash injury? Because those kind of traumas will tell me that at the level of the brain, the processing abilities in those really important centers are probably going to be a little bit muffled. And it's actually really easy to sort it out. We just have to give a few. The statement that I work off of is that neurons that work together, neurons that wire together, fire together. So, for example, at the level of the brainstem, there are lots of other things that happen there, like your humming, your facial expressions, your shoulders elevating, your swallowing, your tongue movement. So we can actually stimulate all those little things that I've just described to you, and that can help to heal the brainstem and can help to light up some of the parts of it which maybe aren't functioning as well.
And one of the things that really, I guess, showed to me this, I mean, it's so obvious on so many levels, but this importance of how our brain and our body is communicating together and different ways we can work with this is during COVID, I picked up I thought I picked up an injury. So I was doing a practice one day, I was playing around, I was doing this like arm balance thing. And when I came out of it, my knee jarred in this weird way and basically froze up. And I had this feeling that like, if I straightened my leg all the way, something was going to pop, and that pop would either be really good or it's going to be like a disaster. So for a few days, my leg was kind of frozen, and I was just, it was weird. And I eventually got an appointment with this guy called David Gray Rehab, who's an Irish specialist in knee injuries. And so it was an online appointment. And very quickly during the session that I did with him, the big thing with my knee is that it never swelled up. And what he was saying is that, well, the fact that it didn't swell up indicates that there's no major tissue damage. So what he was saying to me is, he was like, basically your legs are not very strong. So your brain has recognized that your knee is at risk of injury. So what your brain has essentially done is frozen your knee and has kind of said to you, like, you just can't, you're not using that well enough. You can't use it anymore. And he showed me these really simple exercises around building up a little bit of strength around my hamstrings, a little bit of strength around my calves, a little bit of strength around my ankles. And in the space of 10 minutes, I had full range of motion of my knee again. from going for like 3 days of my knee basically just being locked. And his whole thing was like, you have to just teach your brain to trust your leg. And for me, it was like an absolute, like, mind blowing how these things happening on this unconscious level can just be taking place. And I guess that your brain has this ability to almost override your conscious awareness if it thinks that you're not safe in certain positions.
Yeah, I mean, your conscious awareness is like the tip of the iceberg. It's really your unconscious that's running the show. And one thing that I think your listeners will really appreciate hearing is that your unconscious brain doesn't care if you are thriving or just surviving. It only cares that you're safe. So if you are sitting on the sofa and watching Netflix and chomping on potato chips, it's like, my job is well done. Check me out how safe my human is. But if you are out there really doing things and maybe your capacity, it exceeds your capacity, that's quite scary for your brain. And I have this metaphor, which I think really illustrates the whole concept really beautifully. Because sometimes if you think of your brain as being this hypervigilant organ, you kind of think, oh, I mean, come on, like, get a grip. Like, it's not that bad, brain. You can move your knee. It's not, I've just come out of a handstand. How serious can it be? But imagine just for a moment, you've decided to go on holiday and you've decided to go to a really far away, obscure place. Let's say Cambodia. You can't read the letters on the street signs because you don't know the alphabet. You have no clue what people are saying. You don't understand the language, but you've got your trusty iPhone with maps and you're navigating this world using sign language. Like, oh, can I have a drink of water? Or can I have some food? And as it happens, you've got a little place to stay. You're getting your sustenance and you're enjoying the experience. Then tragedy sets in. First, you drop your iPhone, smash the screen. Your glasses fall off your face and you trample on them and you cannot see. You then trip and you break both arms. How much fun are you going to be having on this holiday?
Not a lot.
No. And it's going to be very scary. It's going to be a very scary place to be. You're not going to feel as comfortable as you would do in your own home had all those sequence of events taken place. And I use this metaphor to illustrate the fact that your brain is really doing the best it can to keep you safe. And even if it's giving you these unwanted outputs of pain, nausea, dizziness, stiffness, fatigue, weakness, those outputs that it's choosing is really to try and keep you safe. And it's because it's not getting the adequate amount of information to help you navigate this intense, crazy world that we're living in. And it's important to also recognize the fact that we have threatening stimuli coming in from a variety of sources, both internally and externally. I mean, even just your alarm shocking you out of your slumber in the morning is, oh, that's quite a lot of stress. And then you turn on the news and it's tragedy. Those are all nociceptive inputs coming to the brain. But then potentially you have that big scar that we mentioned earlier, and you've got this low-grade nociceptive input coming to your brain. And in addition to that, you've had a fight with your partner. That's a lot of threatening input to your brain. And then the final layer is you go to a yoga class and the teacher has this real almost fear-based way that they navigate the class, like stack your knee to keep your knee safe and suck your core in to keep your back safe, and don't do that or you'll compress your lumbar spine, you know, all these cues that we're so used to hearing. And suddenly your brain's like, oh my God, when I play with my kids, I squeeze my bum all the time. I'm going to compress my lumbar spine. Back pain. Too many nociceptive commands coming up at the level of the brain. The brain decides, I can't take it anymore. I can't keep my human safe under these circumstances. All of those variables play a role. And usually when I speak about all these variables, two things happen. One, the people are hearing me are like, this is so overwhelming. Like, how am I going to take into consideration all of these different things you've mentioned? Like, it's too much. But then the additional layer to that is empowerment, because through looking at the body with a holistic lens, you are no longer stuck in this two-dimensional view that my knee hurts because there's something wrong with my knee. There's actually potentially nothing wrong with your knee. Your knee didn't have any swelling. All the structures were great. In 3 minutes, your knee was moving perfectly. So I think it's really about appreciating that there is more going on than meets the eye, and keeping that open-mindedness is really a powerful place to come from.
And I think a lot of people listening would probably be very interested to know, if you don't mind maybe giving us a small little taster of, say, the work that you would do with someone recovering from a concussion. what kind of little exercises you might play around with, or how that might differ from traditional forms of physical therapy?
So the very first thing I do when I'm working with someone post-concussion is I give them a little form to fill in. And it doesn't ask specifically about pain, but it does ask about things like light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, irritability, sadness, lots of other little things, just kind of trying to get an idea of how are they navigating life. And they have a score from 0 all the way through to 6, and they can put little X's. And then the second layer is for me to understand how their fuel supply to their brain is operating. So I'll always ask them about how much they've eaten and what have they had. We need glucose for the brain to function, but we also need oxygen. And so that's when I start looking at their breathing. I triple check that they are breathing with a relaxed core. We don't need an engaged core. Our diaphragm needs to move. That means our bellies will move in harmony with our breath. I check that they aren't over-breathing, because if you're over-breathing, you're blowing off a lot of your CO2. You need to retain CO2 for the oxygen to go into your tissues. And then I'll also do a couple of breathing drills that help to amplify the amount of oxygen perfusing into their tissues. One is air hunger, where people hold their breath during a cardiovascular action. I get them to nasal breathe by taping their mouth at night. And the third thing I'll do is something called the diaphragm stretch. And the diaphragm stretch is really cool because we pull on the lower attachments of the diaphragm as they do a long exhale. And what we see after the diaphragm stretch, we have to test to see if it works for people because everyone's different. But we do often see that people retest a lot better after they've done those various steps of really utilizing their breath in the best way. And then from there, I will start looking at their function in terms of how does their brainstem operate. I mentioned the brainstem earlier in relation to whiplash, and very often post-concussion people have sustained a whiplash injury. And so the brainstem is divided into 3 sections. It contains 10 of our 12 cranial nerves that deal with things that I mentioned before, like your smile, your swallow, your eyes moving in different directions, the shoulders hunching, your head turning, your vocal cords. And we'll just start tinkering around with those and seeing if the person moves their eyes to the left or the right, and we retest, does that improve their symptoms? And then I'll formulate like a little menu of things that I'll give them as homework. I'll tell them, you've got to do, you have to hum 3 times a day and click in your right ear 20 times a day. And once they start seeing that their threat is a little bit more manageable, I'll then move on to more intense things, working on their cerebellum and their vestibular system. This is your balance center, your vestibular system, and your cerebellum works at the level of accuracy, where you're able to do things like thread a needle or tie a button. Balance, which is really important for post-concussion people because they're a little bit off kilter, and also your coordination. So I'll get them to do things like trying to alternate their hands in a clap, seeing can they actually perform that, and just kind of tinkering around with those brain regions, just trying to make them operate at a better level so that when they then go out into the world, it's not so threatening being in everyday lights or, trying to cross the road, turning your head from side to side. That's very scary for someone who's had a post-concussion injury, not all, but many. So just kind of getting those everyday actions and everyday stimuli not to be as amplified. And before each session, they fill in their little form again. And I'm trying to track if the numbers, if they were at the 5s and 6s, are slowly edging towards the 1s and the 0s with each session.
It sounds like really interesting work, and so many little things that we would just take for granted. And I imagine would be so easily overlooked in treating of many things. But one of the things you mentioned there was breathing. And so breathing is obviously a very central aspect to a yoga practice, and also something which has been, I guess, the interest and the study of breathing is something that has intensified and increased a lot over the last 10 to 20 years, it feels like, particularly in understanding breathing's influence on the brain and vice versa. So what I'd be curious, because I know this could be a whole podcast in and of itself, but I guess as you learned more about breathing and the brain, what were some of the big light bulb moments for you, and how would it maybe differ from how people would traditionally approach breathing in yoga, or the contrast to that, any similarities that you would see in traditional breathing practices and how we now understand respiration in the brain?
Well, the first big light bulb moment for sure was that not all breathing practices are good for all people. And I feel like it's again kind of going back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast, where even in the yoga practice, this is the sequence and this is the amazing thing that this teacher created and it's good for everyone. And it just isn't the case. And it's the same with breathing. We can't say that there's a particular type of breathing that's good for everyone. We have to test. And I do get a bit frustrated when people will be in a breathing seminar and the teacher will really be cueing people, like, you got to stick with it. You got to stick with it. And people are having these really adverse reactions. And that's because it's potentially not appropriate for them. And then the second layer to that would be, there are certain types of breathing, like really deep hyperventilation breathing practices, which are really good, by the way. I'm not knocking them. But not enough emphasis is put on the after that, which is the rehab aspect of it. Because if you have been practicing hyperventilation, you then need to put your brain and your body into the opposing state to help to balance the blood gas chemicals that are floating around. And if you are hyperventilating, you then need to be really honored with your nasal breathing and your air hunger to help balance the scales. And again, not enough emphasis is put on that. And I feel like that's a real disservice to people, because when I look around the community, many, many people are over breathing. They're upper chest breathers. Their breathing isn't terrible. They're alive. Wow, you're great. But it's not efficient for what they want to achieve. And very often they are struggling with even mental health issues like anxiety. And it's because they're squeezing their core because they've been told that their belly sticking out is disgusting. And they're upper chest breathing, over breathing, blowing off all of their CO2. And then they're going into a breathing practice where they're told that they have to breathe really fast for a very long time. Otherwise, they're not doing it right. And so, yeah, I just think an individualized approach with breathing is really, really important. And for us to ideally remember that when you're at rest, you should be breathing very, very low and very, very slow. We shouldn't even be knowing you're breathing. We shouldn't hear you breathing. And it should all be happening at the level of the nose. So that was the first thing. However, I will say that when you start delving into the science of breath, it is so fascinating how much ancient wisdom actually has been there all this time, and there's such great science behind it. And my favorite one, I've spoken about the brainstem twice already. This is the third and final one, I promise. But at the level of the brainstem, we actually have the vocal cord cranial nerve. And this cranial nerve is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. And one of the ways we can stimulate it is through humming. And humming not only is great for stimulating this cranial nerve to help lower your sympathetic tone, which means it calms you down and shifts you into rest and repair, but it's also really powerful practice to help increase, I always get them confused, nitric oxide or nitrous oxide. My dyslexic brain always mixes them up. Can you remember, Brian, which one is it?
Nitric.
Nitric, thank you. I'm so glad you're here. The nitric oxide that gets produced actually helps to splint open our airways. So a lot of times when people have blocked airways, they'll go straight for the nasal spray. But honestly, if you just take a moment to just hum your favorite song a few times, or even if you don't have a song in mind, just keep that low level hum going for as long as you can before your next big breath comes in. And you do that a few times, this already stimulates that nitric oxide to help open up the airways. And that's just two of, I think, many, many different benefits, that there is a lot of crossover. So yes, if people can just test and make sure that what they're doing is adequate for their nervous system, I think always doing some kind of focused breath work is really powerful and really healthy.
When you're here, Celeste, I'm going to have to, if we can find the time, I'm going to have to take it to what's one of my favorite little, I don't know how to describe it, one of my favorite things in Dublin, basically. So there's a very small park beside a church in town. For anybody listening, it's called St. Aidan's Church, beside Christ Church. And it's a really interesting little park. I don't know who designed it, but they've loads of little cool things. Like they've this little like stepping stones, I guess. When you jump on them, they make a little noise. There's a little xylophone. But then there's also, I don't know if you've ever heard these before, there's a humming stone. So a humming stone is a slab of rock with holes cut into it at different levels. And basically you stick your head in and you hum. And however it works, when you hum in this humming stone, the vibrations, like you can feel them all the way down to the soles of your feet. It's a really resonant sound. And apparently these humming stones are, I think the oldest one ever found dates back 20,000 years. And they've been found at all sorts of different sites around Europe. And some people theorize that they were a really, really early form of communal ritual, which seems so interesting, that humming, which has this potential to calm us down, settle us, maybe put us in a state where we feel a bit more connected with the people and the things around us, that 20,000 years ago, there was this very intuitive understanding of how something so simple like humming can have such a profound impact on us. So I'll have to take you up, and you can experience a hum in the humming stone.
That would be amazing. Yeah, it would be my honor to be sticking my head inside that big rock. I want to see it.
And one thing that you mentioned there was overbreathing. And for anyone who maybe has never heard that term before, or I guess for some people, the idea of like overbreathing, how is that even like possible? What is overbreathing, and how can it have an adverse effect on how we feel?
So your body is basically just built on the most delicate balance. You know, there's a pH balance, there's chemical balance, and your breathing is really at the center of maintaining the balance within your system. You obviously have blood gases as well. We've got oxygen, we've got carbon dioxide, and a mixture of other blood gases. We've mentioned nitric oxide. And we have to remember that the way you breathe can amplify or mute the amount of gases that you have floating around. If you're exhaling a lot, you're going to be blowing off your CO2. And if you're inhaling a lot, you're going to be taking in a lot of oxygen. And we can have people that are breathing. Sorry. Did you hear that?
No.
You didn't? Okay. God, my partner's making a smoothie, and I was like, oh, sorry, guys. I was like, I told him I'm on a podcast and he's got to keep it down. So you can have someone who's exhaling too much, and those over exhalation that people tend to do blows off too much of your carbon dioxide, because we've been kind of told for a long time, take in all the oxygen and breathe off all the CO2. But actually we need a balance, because yes, that is true on a surface level, but we actually need to maintain an adequate amount of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. Because what carbon dioxide does is it acts as the gatekeeper for getting oxygen from your blood into your tissues. And a brilliant way to describe this is I worked with clients that have something called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. It's off the back of people after they've sustained really severe lung pathologies off the back of long-term smoking. And so they are struggling to even just walk to the toilet without being extremely breathless. And they'll have blue lips, and they'll have blue fingertips, and their little shoulders will be hunched because they're, they get so out of breath. They've really got to try and take these huge, big breaths, but they often use their accessory breathing muscles that are right at the top, and their shoulders shrugging up and down to try and take in enough oxygen. And actually, when we measure their blood saturation, everyone, you, me, and them, even though they're turning blue, has a blood oxygen saturation of around 98 or 90%. They have a lot of oxygen in their blood. But what they don't have is the ability to get the oxygen from their blood into their tissues. That's why their tongue goes blue. That's why their fingertips go cold. So we have to, actually, it's so hard, because the asthma community and the COPD community, they hate the physios for doing this. But the best thing that we can teach this community is actually to just breathe out slowly and take slow, gentle inhales that are smaller than the exhales. And what this does is it just helps them not take in so much oxygen. And also it helps to just balance out the amount of the amount of carbon dioxide that they're releasing. So it helps to just balance the scales a little bit. And it's very, very challenging to get this community to do that, because they honestly feel like they're going to die just walking to the toilet. And I'm not exaggerating saying that. That's not me being tongue in cheek. They feel like every movement challenge that they're about to take, that's even getting out of bed, they're going to die. And so teaching people to actually breathe less which is actually the opposite of what their brain's asking for, is very powerful. And that's why we should all be aiming to lower our respiratory rate per minute. I think the national average is the average internationally should be around 12 to 16 breaths. But actually, for you to function as optimally as possible, we should be aiming for around 6 breaths per minute. And if you're able to hold your breath whilst taking steps, most of us can do like maybe 10 or 20 steps, maybe 30 on a good day. We should be aiming for 100, like to really get our system to work at its most efficient peak possible.
I'm feeling a little bit tense, even it's just the prospect of 100 steps without breathing. But it's something that I have personally worked on myself over the last few years, of kind of building CO2 tolerance, learning to breathe less, learning to breathe lighter. And for anyone who hasn't explored it yet, as you said, it's incredibly uncomfortable at the beginning, but you sort of have to have this trust that your body is, I mean, within reason, it will always breathe in when it needs to. And most of us underestimate our ability to actually withstand that little bit of discomfort, which definitely, in my experience at least, does ease over time. And as you train yourself to breathe a little less, a little bit more easy, a little bit more gently, again, it can sound like such a small thing, but in my experience at least, it's like profoundly beneficial. And just I don't know, this like less is more approach, we can apply it in so many aspects of life, but definitely within breathing, it'll take you very far.
Yeah, and I'm still guilty as a yoga teacher. I'm like, take a big deep breath and let it out. Like it feels so good to do those big sighs. And guys, listen, there is science behind doing those too. That can actually help your vagus nerve, and it can help to get you into parasympathetic. But to encourage people to breathe less, even when they're moving, to sustain nasal breathing during cardiovascular activities. Now when I'm going for my runs, I keep my mouth shut the whole time. And if I'm on the rower, my mouth is shut. I'm doing it all through nasal breathing. And if I can't sustain nasal breathing, I have to drop my pace. Like that is the humility that you have to bring in. So as soon as you switch into mouth breathing, it means you've gone too far, you've done too much, and you need to scale back. That's humble work.
Yeah, definitely. The final thing that I wanted to ask you, just being conscious of your time, and I appreciate everything that you've given to us so far, but I'm a big fan of your Instagram page. I really like the stuff that you post, and you'll often do little things around, I guess, alternative ways of looking at common yoga poses or movements, and I guess breaking the rules a little bit. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that, and maybe the benefits of allowing yourself to be more varied and to think outside the box a little bit when it comes to your movement practice.
Oh, thank you so much for asking this question, Brian. Absolutely. So I spoke earlier about the scar, right? And the scar is sending like less information to your brain. Well, we have to remember that we also have information going from the brain into our bodies, and that helps to map in our brain the complexity of what our body is capable of. And yes, when you first start your practice, you'll feel this huge surge in the way that your body progresses, and the back pain that you had for 15 years suddenly disappears, and it's because you're getting these new neurons are firing, these new maps are forming. But when people start yoga, we're all like this. We love to do what's comfortable and what's within our comfort zone. And so we do get stuck into like a set way of doing stuff, and we repeat things over and over. And for a time that works well, but the brain requires novelty to keep thickening all of the different nerves and neurons, to keep thickening those maps and to make sure that they integrate towards around each other. And so when you are doing your practice, in the beginning, that might be enough, but if we don't keep leveling up, our brain actually plateaus and eventually regresses. So yes, your practice in the beginning is probably adequate, but as you get good at your yoga practice, you should be not just intensifying the poses that you do, but how you utilize your body within each pose. And we can use chair pose, for example. Yeah, it's great that your feet are together and you can squat down to knees in line with hips. Fantastic. But what if you did it with toes in, knees in? What if you did it with a rib circle, almost like you're stirring a pot with your chest? What if you did it with your head gliding side to side? Now, all of those little movements that I've just described, yes, they're off-piste. They don't necessarily fit into the traditional way of doing the practice, but your body has the capability of doing those movements, and we never do those movements. And so the maps in your brain are just slowly fading away, sending all of that neural real estate probably to your thumb so that you can text really well. That's why we're so quick on the phone. We know how to navigate all the apps really fast because we've just done that so many times. But your hand is made up of so many little bones, and we don't exercise all of the complexity. Neurons that wire together fire together. Your hands, your face, your spine, your feet, they occupy huge, huge space. The nerves that are around those huge spaces, they also suffer when you don't exercise the complexity of those areas. And in yoga, we use our big muscles and our big joints, arms stay straight, they lift above your head, hands down, elbows bend, back moves as a whole, body into downward dog where just your hips and ankles are in an angle. But what about the little sections between all that? What about the spinal waves? Thank God that that's a thing now. That's not like frowned upon. But what about your hands doing figure of eights? What about your feet curling around and doing weird shapes? What about your toes moving individually? Like, all of this is stuff your body can do, but if you don't use it, you lose it. And as we get older, we're like, oh, I'm old now, so I'm stiff. No, it's not your age that's the problem. It's that you've not been doing it. If I put a 3-year-old in bed and I said, don't you move for 6 months, they would wake up stiff, just even though they're 3 years old. Like, we've got to keep using our complexity. And it sounds like I'm having a rant, and I really am, because I'm so passionate about people understanding that we're not scratching the surface of our potential. We're doing these poses and we're not realizing that there's more to the human body than just these big shapes that we're hitting every time.
That didn't really sound like a rant to me. It was like a locker room speech. I'm like inspired now to go and move my feet. But it's very true. And just as to emphasize your point, my daughter, who is 3, broke her leg a month ago. So she's in a cast for 4 weeks, and about a week and a half now, it came off. And she's been so tentative about putting weight on her leg again. She's been holding her leg really stiff because that's how it's been held for a month, basically. But because she's 3, it hasn't held her back too much. And you just see how gradually she's just gaining back the confidence and starting to play. Just yesterday, she was doing these little like jumps on her leg, and it's amazing to see the mobility and the movement return. But as you said, so she was in a cast for a month. But if you have someone who for years of their life was spending a lot of time not moving, not going through their movement potential, how that would translate into a stiffness and nervousness. And again, it's not age necessarily. It's just, as I said, like you use it or you lose it. And thankfully we're never over the hill to the extent that we can always get some of it back. I guess it's never too late to begin.
Please don't believe what you read on Google when they tell you your brain stops developing at 25. That's not true. Your brain is always developing. It just depends what you're doing. Like, your brain develops a lot as a child, yes, but then when you stop moving, it starts regressing, of course. But if you're moving, like, everything is movement. Every word you read on a page is movement. Even Stephen Hawking, who had no movement capacity, wrote his books with the movement of his eyes. Life is movement. We have to move, and we have to move to our fullest potential. All the little joints that are not glamorous, because you're not going to look fancy on Instagram doing, a little finger movement. But the fact that your hands can do these movements, please keep exercising whatever potential you have. Maybe you have something like rods in your spine. I understand that that's hard, but make sure you're the most mobile rods with spine in person that is out there. Whatever movement you have, you're exercising it to your best ability. And if you have horrible arthritis in your hands, I can empathize how scary it must be to move, but the less you move, the more you amplify the arthritis. So whatever movement is possible, whatever you can tolerate, keep doing that. Keep thickening those nerves in your brain, because ultimately it's the state of our brain that will carry us well and far into our lives. Yes, our bodies are important, but it's nothing without first having the nervous system to back it up.
Again, very inspiring. And thank you so much for your time, Celeste. It was really great to get the chance to talk to you. We're very excited to have you over in end of October. And again, for anyone who's listening, just in the yoga picnic during the summer as well, definitely a great event to go check out if you can. So thank you again for giving us your time. Thank you for sharing all of your insight and knowledge. And we're looking forward to seeing you over here very soon.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your brilliant questions, and thank you everyone for listening.